Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Sir Gerald Gower, he liked it not. To sail in broad daylight was a fool's errand. And while sailing into Blackwater Bay at night was not something he ever wished to do again, he'd have done so rather than this. His words of warning had been dismissed, as had his words regarding Davos Seaworth. Edric had never liked the Onion Knight, and most of the Stormlords or his fellow knights had looked down on the former smuggler. Gerald was not one of them, for he remembered full well the warnings that Davos had given to Stannis before their failed attempt at taking the city the last time they tried to do so. While he was not a fighting man, Davos was no craven, and he was certainly no fool. Neither was Lord Yerothson, yet Edric, Andrew, and most especially Sansa Stark all seemed more than happy to name them so. So his warnings went unheeded, and as he saw the bay ahead of him, Gerald offered a prayer to the Father to see them be nothing more than unrealized worries and doubts. As he stood on the deck of the Yellow Flower, Gerald looked around at the fleet they had gathered. Though not as large as the one that Stannis had sailed with, they had just as many men and actually had far more traveling by land. Still, he worried that it would not be enough, or they were sailing into a trap of sorts. So, it was on shaky legs that they finally entered Blackwater Bay. Gerald tried not to think of that night, so many years ago. The blackness of the sky before it was illuminated by that accursed green wildfire and the sounds of the screams as men burned to death, as then there were few ships in the bay itself, and again, that gave him pause. Though at least this time there were no fire ships sailing towards them as they made their way deeper into the bay. His eyes turned to where the tower that had held the chain once stood, and he was relieved to see that not only did it no longer stand, but no others had been erected in its place. Looking to the docks, he could see nothing untoward, and yet the hairs on his neck were raised all the same. "We've caught them with their pants down," Martin, his ship's captain, said, and while the older man was smiling as he spoke the words, it was not a smile that Gerald joined in with. Instead, he looked on as the first of their ships docked, and then the second. Gerald watched as men disembarked and as people ran from the docks and left it empty. To all eyes it looked as it should, and yet to his, it seemed nothing more than a mummer's farce. He believed the people moved too swiftly and were far too organized for this to be the panic that it seemed to be. 5 ships had docked by now, and soon it was to be 6. The Stag's Fury, Edric's flagship, now docked before it would then head back to anchor in the bay. Even from the distance he was away from the ship, he could see the red hair of Sansa Stark. He wondered if she and Edric were saying their goodbyes. A part of him wondered, too, if they were to be final goodbyes, and for now he fought down the voice that named it so. Within an hour, the Yellow Flower, too, had docked, and the docks themselves were theirs. In the distance they could see the Red Keep, and other than some small skirmishes with gold cloaks, they'd not found sight nor heard a sound of those who should be defending this city. Upon joining up with Edric, Gerald listened as his lord and the would-be king spoke of their success as if it was guaranteed. He held his tongue when Edric and others spoke of how their mummery had worked perfectly and then awaited his orders before setting out to secure the city. Again he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, and as they moved through the city, he almost expected it before it occurred. "Yushu! Us!" The sound of the horns rang out, and arrows began to rain down upon Gerald and his men. Making for cover, he looked to the roofs, and the sight that greeted him was one that proved all his fears to be true. Countless men lined the route they'd taken, and Gerald would wager that this was not the only street that was defended this way. In the distance, he swore he heard the sound of hoofbeats, and he certainly heard the jangle of armor and arms as men marched with purpose. Looking to his men, he was relieved to see that only a few had fallen to the archers, and yet that relief was to be very short-lived. "Sird! Sird! Look!" Gerald turned and looked on in horror, as the cause of the sound of the armor he'd heard earlier was now revealed to him. Closing his eyes, he named himself a fool for not speaking with a louder and truer voice, and once he opened them again, he pondered whether it would be a surrender or a fight that he'd give this day. Was it not for the fact that he'd allow no man to name him a craven, then he may very well have decided that the order he'd give would be to lay down their arms, even knowing the fight was already a lost cause, and would cost far too many men their lives for no reward, was not reason enough to stop the order that came from his lips. "To arms! To arms!" he shouted, and as he led his men towards the men of the Golden Company, arrows once again rained down upon them from above. Black Balak. He'd picked the men to man the roofs himself. men that he'd taken over the training of or had picked out of the ranks due to the skill they showed. Once he'd done so, it was then to the routes from the docks that Balak had turned his attention. To say he'd been pleased was an understatement. Whoever had designed this city had done a piss-poor job of it in many regards. For the purpose that he now intended to put it to, however, it may well be perfect. The streets were narrow and the buildings on either side of them were tall. Standing upon the roofs of those buildings, you could see everything that happened below and, better yet, hit anything you aimed at with an arrow. Providing you were a decent archer that was better than any of that, you could easily move about atop the rooftops, with some simple laying down of wooden boards to act as bridges of sorts. Balak had full access to each and every street that ran from the docks to the city itself. So, the night before the battle commenced, he'd seen those bridges put in place and had even run the shortest route himself. A route he knew by heart now. It had been something he'd taken full advantage of, both before and during the battle. Ordering the men to hold until the signal was given, Balak had waited until the ships were unloaded, and the men had moved far enough so they could not simply turn and race back to the ships. He'd wished those ships to be set ablaze once the men had landed, only for the hand of the king to deny him leave to do so. We'll need those ships in the future, and they'll be the basis of a new royal fleet. So no, I'll not see them burned, if it can be helped, Davis said. As you command, Lord Hand. Balak disagreed, and yet did not. While it would make their task much easier and would end this war today, rather than risk it being a much longer one, it would force a truer fight, mayhap. Men with no place to retreat to would often fight to the bitter end. Even knowing a retreat was impossible due to the forces you faced was something different than knowing it was a forlorn hope right from the start. So despite his own wishes, Balak deferred to those who were more in charge than he. He'd no wish to get on the wrong side of the dragons. After all, with his hand raised, he ordered more arrows to be fired and looked to where he knew Lyserna would be. Once he saw his former fellow sergeant, Balak gave his orders and began to move across the bridges. He saw some men try to force open the doors of buildings and seek cover there, and he smiled when he saw their attempts fail. They'd blocked up all the doors and windows, and while some may find a little respite and force their way in, it would be but a temporary thing. It took him but a few moments to reach his destination, and he looked down to see that these were indeed the men being led by the Fool of Stag himself. The men he'd left on the roof had done their job well, and they'd stopped them from moving forward while not truly taking too many from their ranks. A mummery amidst a mummery was what Balak had bid them to accomplish, and they'd done exactly as he'd asked. Now, as Lyserna led his men forward and the Stag did his best to form up his lines, it was time to bleed them for true. Take down as many as you can. Protect our men, he said, as his former comrades from the Golden Company and men who'd taken service with him, Lyserna or who had earned keeps of their own, all now brought the fight to a Stag who wished to be king. Arrows rained down, and this time they hit home for true. One even managed to hit the shield held by the Stag. Balak looked on as men who fought for a living faced off against men who very much did not. Fierce and proud, the men of the storm may be, but they were not true soldiers, and the proof was clear for all to see. Losiano and he had fought in cities and outside them. They'd fought on open fields and in places that were very much not. These men of the storm were no match, and so soon enough, men began to throw down their weapons and surrender. Fire only to save our men, he ordered as he left that rooftop and moved to another. The fight was all but done, and it was one worthy of tale. Though he doubted very much it would be a tale spoken fondly in the Stormlands. Varys. The Red Keep was as protected as it could be. Davos had refused to move elsewhere, and so the gates were locked, the number of guards increased, and the tunnels ready just in case. Not that Varys believed that they could lose the battle. He held no fear of that, but he'd not be caught out again. Had he done the same years earlier, then a princess and her son would not have faced such terrible ends. As for the rest of the small council, while Lady Anya and others may have wished to do as Davos did, in this he had more success. They'd been moved to Rosie and would await there until one of his little birds told them differently. Varys had pretty much ensured that most of his little birds were far from where any of the fighting would go down. Only those he needed to bring him news of the battle would be out and about this day, and even they would be far from where a true fight took place. The systems he'd put in place would see to that. Now, as he read the first of the songs that were sung, Varys found himself thinking back to another attempt to take this city. Thankfully, it was not one that cost a king his life or tore a family from the Iron Throne. but instead it was one that too involved a stag who wished to be king. Then it had been Tyrion Lannister that he'd sought comfort and aid from. Today it was Davos Seaworth, and as he read the songs, he found he much preferred things this time around. He may have named Tyrion a friend once, but the truth about him had been revealed, and it had not been a pleasant one. Varys had no doubts that the truth of Davos Seaworth was not a hidden thing, and the man was simply as he appeared to be. It was a comforting thought as he read about the ships being allowed to dock and as a battle for the city and the Iron Thorn began anew. "Thank you, go and be safe," he said as another of his little birds popped their head into his room and handed him yet another song. This time the words needed to be shared, and so he rose to his feet and made his way to where he believed Davos Seaworth would be. Varys quickly found the man atop the parapets of the Red Keep itself, looking down at the city below and the docks in particular. Though they could see little from here, the sounds of the battle that was taking place and the sight of the arrows being fired from the rooftops were clear enough. Placing a hand on the man's shoulder, he was greeted by a worried frown and hoped the words he spoke were enough to remove it. In the end, while they did somewhat, it was what they both saw and heard that truly did so. "The Battle of the Kingswood is over, Davos. Sir David and Sir Morton have been victorious. For true? For true, they ride to add their forces to our own should they be needed," he said to a relieved look from the hand of the king. Just as he was about to say more, another of his little birds arrived, and Varys almost tittered at the fact they'd found him here. Yet it was the sound of the roar and the happy laugh that came from Davos Seaworth that he at first concentrated on. Afterward, it was the sight of the green dragon as it flew over the bay and towards them. Its flames were being let loose at something or other beneath it. "I should have bloody expected it," Davos said jovially. "You should?" he asked. "Aye, he'd never let us face a fight alone," Davos said as both he and then the hand of the king turned to make ready to greet a king, Edric Baratheon. Edric ran. He ran in any direction he could, as long as it was away from the fight. Though he'd never believed himself to be a craven, and even now would refuse to name himself so, acting one was in his best interest. The fight was over. He'd lost, and his dreams of being a king were now no more. Even should he manage to escape this city and make it back to Storm's End, he would wager he'd find no sanctuary there. Not with the dragon seeking him out, and seek him out it would. That much was more than clear. He should have paid more attention to Sir Gerald's worries and concerns. Listened to what was being said to him, and at the very least, kept it in mind. Instead, he got so caught up in the thoughts of the easy victory that was sure to be his, that he ignored all the warning signs. No ships to slow their progress through Blackwater Bay. A lack of any resistance when they landed, and even the small force that came against them had all been but mummeries. The truth of the matter was that they'd lured Edric and his army in, and once they had them where they wished, then and only then did they attack. As he ran through the city and heard the sounds of the fighting behind him, Edric tried to focus on anything positive. He had at first believed that if he could get out of the city and to the rest of his army, he'd be able to regroup and attack with a much larger force. Surely they didn't have the men to stop both sides of his army, he hoped. Edric had ignored the small voice within himself, which said that if they were this prepared for them inside the city, then they would be even more so outside of it. Then he'd heard and seen the green dragon, and it had mattered not. "He'll burn us all," he said under his breath, as he stopped to look behind him and to catch his breath. Sansa had told him what Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen had done to the army led by Malcolm Mygarin. How the dragons had decimated a force that was 20,000 strong, and while there, it had been all 3 dragons. Edric was under no illusion that one wouldn't be just as effective. Hearing the sound of men running towards him, Edric looked back and was soon racing for his life once more. They were not his own men, and he was alone in this city now. He had considered trying to make it to the docks and his ship and then meet up with his wife, but had quickly dismissed the thought. Ships burn far too easily, and the only thing that would stop the dragon from loosing its flames upon him was the cover. The city provided, "What am I to do once that cover's gone?" he asked himself, and found no answer. Dodging down another side street, Edric tried not to think of how quickly it had all gone wrong. They had marched through the empty streets. Then there were arrows fired at them from the rooftops, and they had made vain attempts to reach the archers. All of that had just been a prelude, and it was the men of the Golden Company who truly put his own men to the sword. Men against boys it had been, and he realized that in truth he was but a boy still. He should have been content and remained happy with his lot. Edric should have accepted that he was Lord of the Stormlands, and sought out a bride that brought him far more than Sansa Stark did. Yet, just like his father before him, he'd wished for a Stark bride, and while at first the reasons had been different, Edric wouldn't lie and say he did not feel something for Sansa Stark once he'd met her. After that, he'd gotten swept up in a song, a tale to be told for years to come, or so he'd thought. At least in that, I'll get my wish, Edric thought bitterly. Stop in the name of the king, the loud voice called out, and it took him out of his pondering as Edric looked to see the man wearing the gold cloak of the city watch come his way. Looking around and finding himself thankful that it was but the one man in his way, Edric drew his sword and readied himself for the fight. At one point, he'd wished to wield a hammer like his father. In truth, he was not equipped to do so, and so it had been the sword for a true fight and a hammer for show. That Edric wielded, thanking the gods that it was the sword he still bore, he readied for the strike. His opponent aimed at him, it quickly came, and he dodged it easily. As he did the next one, Edric allowed one more strike, and then began to reply. Very soon, it became apparent that he was far more skilled than the man he faced, and after no more than a moment or two, his sword struck home. The wound was not a mortal one, and so Edric moved forward to take the man's life, only for the shouts to stop him from doing so. There he is! Stop him! A glance back behind him showed him the true peril of his predicament, and so, once again, Edric began to run. To his great relief, he managed to lose the men and soon found himself in sight of the king's gate. He tried not to let his mind dwell on the fact that he'd run no more than a few streets from where he'd started. It had felt as if he'd been running for hours, when in truth it was mayhap no more than one. Instead, he simply concentrated on the fact that he finally had a chance to escape and to be free of the 7 hells that this city had turned into. For him and his army, at least. Moving more slowly than he had done up to then, Edric crept towards the gate. He looked to the walls above it and found to his amazement there were no guards in sight. As for the ones on the ground, they were looking not to where Edric moved from, but much further down the street where the battle was near or at its end. Steadying himself, Edric walked to the gate and then out through it unchallenged. No sooner had he done so than the gate closed behind him, and he looked to see a man bearing a white cloak and another with hair as red as his wife's own. It took him a moment to recognize both men. Not simply because he had not expected them to be here, but because of the green dragon and the man who stood beside it who were now in his way. Jon Snow had somehow expected him and had simply lain in wait. With him he'd brought Jaime Lannister and the wildling he was so close to, and while they and a group of guards that Edric now saw moving to join them blocked his way back into the city, a dragon and a king blocked his way away from it. Glancing over Jon Snow's shoulder, Edric almost expected to see the rivers of the Trident, and he had no doubt that he would not be offered a chance to yield or surrender. It was to be a fight between a dragon and a stag once more that would decide the fate of Westeros, and as odds go, it was far better than those he'd so far faced this day. If I make it past you, he asked, then you are free to go where you please. Though I'd wager my wife would seek you out eventually, Jon Snow replied. You'll accept no surrender, he asked, though he knew full well the answer he was to receive. Would you have accepted mine own, or did you and your wife not seek the deaths of me and my family once you sat on the Iron Throne? We would have, yes. Then no, you die today. Edric Storm, you and House Baratheon both end, and the only thing I'll offer you is a quick and clean death. Sighing, Edric moved forward and he looked on as Blackfire was unsheathed. The green dragon lay down its head and looked almost disinterestedly at him, while behind him not a single man seemed concerned for their king. It took barely 2 clashes of the swords to show him why that was. Edric had sparred against Jon Snow and had been taught a most painful lesson. He'd thought that he'd seen the truth of him that day, the full extent of his skill, so he'd put more work in the yard at Storm's End, and had improved greatly. Or so he believed. The truth of the matter was very much different. While he may have improved some, the lesson that Jon Snow had wished to teach him that day was merely that. Today he sought his life, and on the 3rd clash of the swords, Edric was caught across the shoulder. He barely had the time to raise his sword to block the next strike, and on the next one, he lost both his sword and his life. Jon Snow moved inside his guard. He took his sword from his hand with the hilt of Blackfire, and Edric cried out in pain when he felt the sharp Illyrian steel pierce him under his arm. His blue eyes looked into the purple ones of the man who had ended his life, and he saw no pity, no remorse, and some hatred there. Falling to the ground, Edric gasped and spat out the blood that had pooled into his mouth. "My sister and you were both fools, Edric. The world will be a much better place without either of you in it," Jon Snow said as he moved behind him, and Edric felt the sword pierce his shoulder and go through his body before he then felt no more. Sansa Baratheon. She stood on the deck of the Stag's Fury. They were anchored in Blackwater Bay, and she'd kissed her husband and even tied a favor to his arm before they'd parted. As she had when the ship had sailed back into the bay, Sansa now looked to the city and the streets, as well as the Red Keep that loomed large over it all. Thus far, things had gone even better than they had planned. Their mummery had worked, and they'd caught the city unawares, and Sansa was certain that it was only a matter of time before she and Edric were reunited and named the Red Keep their home. So certain was she of this, that in her mind Sansa had already begun to make changes, both to the furnishing and to how their rule would be different than her bastard cousin and his dragon whore. Of a wife's. She had begun to ponder even more on the changes she'd make to the realm too. Edmure, Anya Waynwood, and Arya. All of them would need to pay for their betrayals. Sansa now found she was torn between making them do so quickly or firming up their reign first. Would she make them kneel before her and swear their fealty? Allow them to believe that was enough? Give them time to think they'd won back the favor they'd lost with her? Would it be better to remove them quickly, or more satisfying to allow them to ponder upon their fate? The truth of the matter was she knew not. The part of her that felt wronged almost demanded it be righted as soon as they took their throne, while the other part of her, the part which understood how the world truly worked, wondered if it would be best to deal with the true threat first. In the end, she had almost resolved that it would be that course of action she'd follow, and was just doing so when the ship's captain came her way. "The fight has begun, my lady," the captain said as he handed her the Marischai. Taking the Marischai, Sansa pointed it in the direction of the docks, and was soon smiling as she watched the gold cloaks being easily beaten by her and Edric's men. All too soon it was over, and the army had begun to move into the city itself, meaning that she could no longer see them from her vantage point. With little to look at, Sansa handed the Marischai back to the captain and made her way to her and Edric's cabin. The next hour was spent looking through her chests and making sure the clothing she wished to wear once the city was taken had not been damaged in the traveling. Her husband had been most generous, and for the first time in far too long, Sansa once again had a wardrobe worthy of a queen. In time, she'd expanded even more and add much more jewelry to her attire as well. For now, they had limited funds, and so, in that regard, her chest was lacking. Time spent waiting was boring, Sansa soon found, and after one more visit to the deck, she decided to have her meal and even allowed herself a glass or two of wine with it as she awaited the good news. Even after she had finished her meal, however, the news was slow to appear, and so once again, it was to the deck that she found herself walking. No sooner had she reached it than she wished she had not. While she couldn't see the fighting that must still be taking place, the sight she could see was one that sent a bolt of fear straight to her heart. So much so that she almost collapsed on the deck and barely heard the captain order the anchor to be lifted and the ship to set sail. "Captain? We must find safe harbor, my lady, we must," the captain replied, and Sansa nodded as she looked at the ever-growing shape of what could only be a dragon that now flew towards them. There was no need for her to see the green scales to know which dragon it was, nor to take the Marischai and look through it to see who rode upon it. As he had ever since he'd come back from the dead, Jon Snow was here to deny her what was hers by right. With a glance to the docks, she found few worries for her husband and far too many for herself. Unable to move from the spot she stood upon, Sansa instead simply looked on as the dragon drew ever closer. To her relief, the ship had begun to move, and yet that relief was to be short-lived. The sight of the banner that stood so proudly atop the mast was now one that sent Sansa into a panic. A black-crowned stag on a yellow field would name the ship as what it was, and while she'd thought that to be a good thing, she now was certain it was very much not. "Remove the banner," she shouted out as the dragon finally flew overhead. At first, Sansa believed that somehow they'd not been seen, that Jon was instead concentrated far more on what was happening inside and outside of the city than on the ship she sailed upon. She almost laughed manically in her relief, only for the sound that came from her to be instead one of great pain. She'd not even seen the dragon let loose its flames. So when she looked down upon her yellow and black dress and saw it burn, it made no sense to her. Only when she felt her flesh as it too began to burn did she realize that far from missing them as it flew over, the dragon had done exactly as it had wished to do. Running as fast as she could, the pain growing unbearable, Sansa jumped over the rail of the ship and crashed hard into the water below. The fire she'd been engulfed in, but a moment earlier, had been extinguished, and while the ship burned and would sail no more, she had somehow survived. Though that survival had come at great cost, and as she looked at her hand and arm, she cried out in horror. Where once there had been skin as pristine as porcelain, now there was anything but. As she floated in the water, she brought her unburned hand to her face, and felt one side of it to be untouched by the flames that she'd been caught up in. With great trepidation, she moved her hand to the other side of her face, and then she knew only darkness. Days later, "It's time," the voice said to her, and Sansa squinted in the darkness, and looked to see a shape lit up by the light behind it. A shape that looked familiar to her. "Jon?" she asked, worriedly. "Aye, it's time for you to pay for all you've done, Sansa." King's Landing 307 AC. Aegon Targaryen. He'd wished to fly alone, and yet, by the end he'd given in to his wife's and his sister's wishes. So together with Tormund and Jaime Lannister, Aegon had mounted Rhaegal and headed for Westeros. They'd rested when they had no other choice but to do so, and had talked little on the journey. There were no words for him to express what it was he was feeling, and he was glad that neither Tormund nor Jaime had needed them. He hated her for making him do this and for leaving his family behind while he did so. Hated himself a little for not simply taking her from the world when he'd had the chance. The thoughts that she'd learn a little semblance of what it was he'd gone through had been what he'd let guide him, and he'd been a fool to believe that Sansa had lost any sense she had and had learned all she ever would. This time, he'd promised himself that he'd make no such errors of judgment. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of Pentos that Aegon felt the need to speak about what it was they would face. The night before they flew across the narrow sea, allowing him or forcing him to do so. Even now, here today, he could well remember the words he'd spoken, and he wondered if they'd ever leave him. Pentos, King's Landing, a few days earlier. Tormund set up the fire and Jaime watched his back, even though there was no need for him to do so. Aegon spoke softly to Rhaegal about the fight to come and how it would be much different than the others they'd faced. If Lady Melora was right, and Aegon had no doubt she was, then he'd not truly be needed in the fight to come. Most of it, if not all, would be over long before they reached King's Landing. It would just be the aftermath that he'd be needed for, and even that, not truly. Bidding Rhaegal to rest, Aegon turned and walked to the fire. He accepted the plate of food that Tormund offered him and bid Jaime to sit and eat with them. Even though it was just the three of them, Jaime at times still took his duties far too seriously. They were in no danger here, nor would they be in any in King's Landing, at least not physically, emotionally, mentally. Well, they were different matters altogether. "Eat, King Crow," Tormund said, and Aegon tried to comply, though it was a wasted effort. "I've no appetite, Tormund. Knowing what I must do, I've no appetite," he sighed. "She brought it on herself, Your Grace," Jaime said sympathetically. "Aye, she did, King Crow," Tormund added. "She was my sister once. Never as much so as Arya was, but my sister all the same. When we were but boys, Robb and I would act her guards and think ourselves as knights of the realm." Aegon began, "The North may not truly care for such things, other than a few places. But we were boys, and we'd read of the men of the King's Guard," he said, looking to Game. "Of Rhaegan Redwine and Aemon, the Dragon Knight. The Bold and the Sword of the Morning, or Duncan the Tall. We dreamt of being known as they were. And for me, even later, the thoughts of earning a name such as those were something I held to deeply." "Your own name is well known, King Crow," Tormund said with a chuckle. "At the Wall, when I heard of what happened with my uncle, my brother, a part of me wished to rescue my sister and I. Had it been Arya still held in King's Landing then, I may have even tried, foolish as that may have been." Aegon said, ignoring Tormund's jape. "I felt guilty about that when Sansa arrived, beaten and battered, raped and worse. I thought I found my purpose with her, and I'll not lie and say that I thought her a true sister when we marched to Winterfell." "She proved herself not to be, Your Grace," Jaime said, and Aegon nodded. "I thought I wished her to suffer as I had suffered, and so that's why I spared her life after her trial. In truth, I couldn't bring myself to take her life," he said, almost as if he had just realized it. "Now, I know I'm to take it, and all I can think is that she was my sister once," Aegon said, rising to his feet. They flew the next day, and he'd felt his resolve strengthen. When they arrived at Blackwater Bay, he'd looked down and seen the ship, and he knew she was aboard, resolving himself to do as he must, allowing Rhaegal's own feelings to guide him. Aegon closed his eyes, and they flew over the ship. Opening them as soon as they got there, he swore he could see her red hair as she stood upon the deck of the ship, and it stopped him not. "Dracarys," he said firmly, and Rhaegal answered immediately. From there it was to the docks, and then the city. Rhaegal let out roars to announce their arrival. Looking down from atop the Green Dragon's back, Aegon could see the fight was already won, just as Lady Melora had said it would be. So he bid Rhaegal to fly to the Red Keep and landed in the Godswood. No sooner had they dismounted than they were joined by Davos and Varys, and Aegon welcomed the former with a hug and the other with an offered hand. "Your Grace, all is well?" Davos asked. "Aye, Davos. The fight in the city is almost done." "Outside the city too, Your Grace," Varys said, and Aegon nodded. "Davos, I need ships sent to the burning wreck of Edric Storm's flagship. Tell them to seek out any survivors." "At once, Your Grace," Davos said as he ran off to do as Aegon had bid him to. "Lord Baratheon, Your Grace," Varys asked, "will be dealt with presently. We'll speak when it's done, Lord Varys. You have my thanks for all you've done thus far. It's my honor to serve you and Her Grace, Your Grace. And ours to have you do so," he replied. With a nod to Jaime and Tormund, they moved back to Rhaegal and were soon in the air once more. They landed outside the city, and once Jaime had done what he needed and Tormund had joined him, Aegon waited. It was not a long wait, and yet it was far longer than the fight that came once Yedric arrived. He took no pleasure in ending the man's life, far from it, nor did he in seeing her when she was carried into the Red Keep. Her burns were extensive, and while for the briefest moment the thought of letting her live with them entered his mind, he dismissed it very quickly. She had to die. There was no other choice. The mere fact that she had been his sister once made no difference to that. So he bid her looked after and sent her to a dark room to spare her the sight of herself before she met her end. Now, it was private. That was the only accommodation he'd allowed her. Not because she deserved it, but simply so she'd not be tortured more than she needed to be. He could have let more people see what she now looked like. Aegon knew how much that would hurt her, and yet taking her life was enough, and so he did not. Instead, it was the members of the small council and the leaders of the men who'd fought for this city that would bear witness to her death. Aegon had gone to her cell himself, and he'd been the one who'd led her to the block. He'd not be the one to take her head, however. Varys, Tormund, Jaime, and Davos, most of all, had all spoken to him and told him that he could and should not be the one to kill her. That as much as he may believe that the man who passed the sentence should swing the sword, in this case, he very much shouldn't. Once he'd agreed with them, it had then led to far too many people offering to do so. Tormund, Jaime, Serta Devon Lannister, and Morton Waynwood. Had Jon Connington been here, then he'd no doubt have offered, and so Lizano Mar did so in his stead. In the end, it could be only one man, and Aegon knew he was both reluctant to swing the sword, and yet would do so anyway, which was only part of the reason why he chose him. She had been his sister once, just as Davos had been somewhat of a father to him since they'd known each other. One of them had been far better at it than the other, and so it was to him that Aegon looked. "Was Aegon? Aegon, please, please," Sansa cried out as Jaime and Tormund held her arms and bid her head to bow. "Please, don't do this. Sansa Stark, you have been found guilty of treason against their graces. Queen Daenerys and King Aegon Targaryen and sentenced to death. Do you have any last words before your sentence is carried out?" Brother, please." Sansa shouted out as Aegon looked at Davos and nodded. Blackfire was raised in the air, and around him, Aegon could hear nothing at all. Looking at the half-burned face of Sansa and to where now only a few strands of red hair remained, he could barely recognize her as who she was. Briefly, he saw who she had once been, and the little girl who loved lemon cakes and who'd been the apple of her mother's eye was there once again. A blink of his eyes later, and the sword was swinging downward, and then a flash of red was all Aegon saw as Sansa lost her head. Turning to walk away, knowing full well that his orders regarding her body would be adhered to completely, Aegon wiped a lone tear that fell from his eye. "She was my sister once," he said softly as he entered the Red Keep. King's Landing 3007 AC. Jaime Lannister. He'd been ordered to rest when he had wished to stand guard at Aegon's door. Told that amongst the men they had here already, all of whom had been vouched for by both Varys and Davos. There were more than enough men to guard Aegon's chambers. Yet it was only Aegon telling him that he'd need to be seen by his side on the morrow that had, in the end, gotten Yen to follow his king's orders. Even then, he didn't get to do so immediately, as he wished to speak to Davin on the battle, and more so, the West. So after taking his meal, Jaime made his way through the city to the Lannister Manse, where Davin and some of those who rode with him were holding their own celebrations. He knew that before they left this city to fly back to the Queen and princesses, a much larger and truer celebration would need to be held. A feast to honor those who'd fought and protected this city from those who'd wished to take it for their own. Those poor fools who'd not been content with all they'd been given, and so had sought more. Tonight, though, it was a somewhat truer feast, a soldier's feast, as Jaime had named it once. Reaching the gates of his family's manse, Jaime was stopped, but briefly. His golden hair was long and flowing once more, while his beard was neatly trimmed. The white cloak he wore was pristine, and his armor glistened. Even if all of that was not enough to name him as one of Aegon's Dragon Guard, the golden hand he wore would name him as Jaime Lannister. So after a quick look over by the two men on guard, Jaime was escorted past the men who ate and drank with abandon in the grounds of the manse and into the manse itself. He was led down halls and corridors he remembered all too well, and finally into the large open room that was fuller than it had ever been, or at least it was so to Yamei's recollection. "Sorkame," Davin asked, his expression one of more concern than it should have been. "I'm here of my own accord, cousin," Jaime answered, letting Davin know he was not about the king's business, and so he could relax. "Will you join me in a drink then, cousin?" "I will," he replied. Jaime turned down the offer of a plate of food and welcomed the wine when it touched his lips. As with all things concerned with his family, it was a good vintage, and he chuckled a little to see how little some things change. Taking a seat beside his cousin, Jaime praised him and the men of the West for their victory. He even held a toast to them, which it seemed was much welcomed, though Davin was quick to point out just how poorly prepared Edric Storm's army was to face them. "I swear they thought they'd just turn up unopposed to the gates, cousin. As if just because their graces weren't here, no one would lift a finger to stop them. I heard they had tried some mummery of heading north, of making that seem their true target." "Mummer's farce," Devon scoffed. "Did they forget who the Meister of Whisperers is? What he's capable of?" Apparently they did. Sansa Stark sent messages to Varys naming herself good and true, and yet plotted against a king, queen, and princess. Edric Storm believed himself to be his father. "Come again," James said, not naming the man by the name the king and queen had granted him. He believed that the realm was just crying out for another Robert Baratheon. The laughter was loud and true. Devon then shook his head before then taking another swallow from his glass. "What is it with stags, I wonder?" Davin said, and Jaime smirked. "They think themselves dragons, cousin. Then the fact they've no wings of their own should have given them pause." Davin spoke then of just why he brought so many men to bear for the king and queen. Jaime listened firstly to that, and then to how his cousin and his new wife were getting along. He was more than pleased to hear of Davin's own happiness with his bride, even most so to hear how Davin named his cousin Joy as seeming to be just as happy with her husband as her husband was with his wife. "I believe she's happy, Jaime. I believe I make her happy. She's with child, 2 or 3 moons gone only, but, gods, it's more than I wished for." "I'm most pleased to hear it, Davin." "Truly. You both deserve to know such contentment in your lives. And name it more than that on my side, at least. But you know me, Jaime. I'll never shame her nor mistreat her. That's not who I am." Dany slapped Davin on the back and hoped that was enough to let him know that he was as happy with the match as Davin and Joy seemed to be. He asked about his Aunt Gaina and his other cousins, actually wishing to know about them for once. Then after one more drink, Dany made his way from the manse and back to the Red Keep. Upon his arrival there, it was to find that Tormund had gotten truly drunk and had needed to be carried to his bed, something that was no surprise whatsoever. He walked past the king's chambers once more to make certain that Aegon was well protected. Jaime happy to see the 4 guards who stood there and how diligent they seemed to be. Then made his way to his room and his bed, waking the next morning from a thankfully dreamless sleep. Jaime hurriedly dressed and then walked most quickly to the king's chambers. To no one's surprise, especially not his, the king was already up and at work. Though thankfully he'd not yet left his chambers and it was simply papers he was reading and signing when Jaime entered the room. "You've eaten?" the king asked, and Jaime shook his head. "I'll send for food for us both, and once we've broken our fast, we'll go and see if we can wake Giantsbane from his slumber. Aegon said, mischievously. They ate, and talked about the upcoming feast and that Aegon intended to stay no more than 3 more days before heading back east. Jaime was asked if there was anything he wished to do in the city or a message he may wish to send to his family. While Aegon spoke too of the letter he'd written to his sister in the north explaining why he'd done what he had, to Jaime's eye, Aegon seemed to have gotten over whatever sadness he may have felt over Sansa Stark's death. Though knowing how the loss of family can affect you and come at you in waves, he was sure that once his king returned to his wife, the emotions would come flooding back. Mayhap even more so given that it was by Aegon's own order that the woman had lost her life. The noise at the door and the stumbling of Tormund as he staggered into the room was enough to take both Jaime and Aegon from their thoughts and conversation. I told you to go easy, Aegon said, chuckling. I went fucking easy, King Crow. Yaxley looked at the king, who nodded, so he rose from where he'd been sitting, and breaking his fast, to walk to where the wine jug was located. Filling a mug, he carried it over and handed it to the still, barely awake Tormund, who drank it down in one swallow. More, Tormund called out after belching loudly. One more. That's your fill until the night, Tormund. We've much work to do. Aegon said, and Tormund looked at the king as if he'd grown an extra head. Besides, we'll be having a true feast before we leave 3 days hence. A true one, Tormund said as Jaime handed him the second mug of wine. Aye. Now drink and eat something for the old god's sake. Tormund did as he was bid, and so, after Aegon had finished writing out commands, authorizing works, and adding suggestions to whatever papers that Daenerys or Varys had seen brought to him, it was a tour of the city, and a visit to each of the camps of the men who'd fought the Battle of King's Landing, Lysanne Omar and the men of the Golden Company, Davon and the men of the West, and those of the Vale, down to the docks and even to the vanquished few. Aegon visited them all before they finally headed back to the Red Keep. His king answered almost any questions that were thrown his way by those who they passed in the street. Aegon told them that their queen and princess were safe and well, and would return to them before the year was done. Something that surprised Jaime as he'd expected them to be staying in Essos for much longer, though mayhap they would all fly back as their armies moved or there was some other explanation that Jaime knew not. Whatever the truth of it, it seemed to make those who heard their king tell them of it most happy. Eventually they said their farewells to those that Aegon had stopped to speak to, and they were soon returning to the Red Keep. Once there, it was to truer meetings that the king bid Jaime attend alongside him. Tormund joined them until Vone took him from the king's chambers to wherever he saw fit to spend his time. Jaime, however, stayed and listened in as Aegon spoke to Varys and Davos, and as more plans were made for the realm. He was stunned to find that Maya Stone would soon be named the Lady of Storm's End, as he was to find out that she would arrive before they departed. That night they ate a quiet meal. Aegon, Tormund, Davos, Varys, and Jaime all sat down to eat and speak on less important matters. He wasn't given leave to act as a dragon guard. Instead, they ate almost as a family and certainly as friends. Years earlier, he'd once pictured himself enjoying such times with a prince that he never got to truly serve. Now, smiling at a jape that Tormund had made at the king's expense, Jaime found himself somewhat living that dream, while at the same time, he looked forward to their flight back to Essos. Jaime wished to see the queen and the princess once again, as he did to continue to serve in the role he had always believed he was born for. King's Landing, 3007 AC. Varys mourned them not. Not Edric Storm, who'd been given far more than a bastard son of Robert Baratheon had deserved, and yet had thrown it all away in pursuit of even more. Nor Sansa Stark, who had she been as true a sister to the king as her sister Arya was, would have been named as the Lady of Winterfell and Warden of the North, rather than losing her head after being touched by a dragon's flames. He mourned them not because after what had been so many years of war, Westeros should have known naught but peace, something that it would now know thanks to the actions that he, Davos, Ser Davin, Ser Morton, and the king had taken. Now, with the two ringleaders of this poor attempt at a coup finally dealt with for good, it was time to deal with those foolish few who'd followed their liege lord and his lady wife on their path to ruin. The Stormlands needed to be put to rights, and few, if any of these former lords or their heirs would be left in their positions when it was done. Varys looked over the list and made his way to speak to those he felt could or could not be brought back to the right side. The men he would now take the time to look into the eyes of and judge for true. The first among them were those who were closest to Edric Storm, Edric's kin and the men who had traveled with him when he'd gone east, As he walked down the steps that led to the dungeons, Varys looked over the list he held in his hand once more and was surprised at just how many of them had survived the fight. Ser Gerald Gower's injuries could still yet kill him, while Ser Andrew Estermont would certainly survive his own. Lord Casper Wilde had thrown down his arms once it became clear that the fight was a forlorn one, and he was not alone in doing so. Some of the Stormlords had at least the good sense to know when they were beaten, though it was those who had been clever enough to send no men or offer no swords to the stag who wished to be king that would truly benefit in the future. Reaching the cells, Varys put his list back in his cloak and ready to speak to those he'd come to talk to. "He's comfortable?" Garrus asked the guard, who nodded and opened the cell door. "He is, my lord." Walking into the cell, Varys was hit first by the smell. Despite their best efforts, Sekerold's wounds had festered, and he'd be lucky if he kept the arm that had been slashed deeply in the fighting. Looking at the man as he sat up on the bed, Varys wondered if it wasn't for the best to simply remove him completely from the board. Yet, for now, he wished to know the man's mind before he made that decision. So he spoke to Sekerold Gower and told him the fate of those who'd fought with him, the man and woman who'd led them, and what was to be done with the Stormlands because of it. "Your liege is dead, Sir Gerald. He died at the hands of the king in a one-on-one battle, a fight he was ill-prepared for and outmatched in, as were you and those who rode with you." "I rode for my king," Gerald said before coughing violently. "There is only one king, and that man is a dragon, not a stag. What possessed you all to take on their graces is beyond me." They both faced down death itself in the north. Later they broke an army of tiger cloaks that then sought to take advantage of their march to Dorne. Right now her grace leads their army in Essos, and at each and every place they've marched to, another city has knelt and named her and his grace as their lieges. Yet fools that you were, you thought that you'd be the ones to deny them their rights. Edric was a fool, Sir Gerald. Yet, since you cling to his tail still, you leave me with no choice." Varys said, turning to walk to the door. "Will it be clean at least?" Segerold asked as Varys neared the door. "Cleaner and less painful than you deserve. Make your peace with the gods, Sir Gerald, for you'll be joining them before the night is past." Leaving that cell, Varys moved to Lord Casper's. The man he found inside was much more accommodating, and so would probably keep his lands if the king agreed to it. Next, he moved to some of the other lords, and once he told them who it was that would now rule over the Stormlands, they too seemed far more accommodating to his and the crown's wishes. Lastly, it was to Ser Andrew's cell, and upon entering it, he was unsurprised to see the man chained and bound. "Fear me, do you, spider?" Sire Andrew said, pulling on his chains. "Why would I, good sirrah? You're as harmless as a fly, and well, we spiders eat flies all the time." Varys tittered. "What do you want with me, then? For I've no desire to suffer your presence." "I care not for your desires, Sir Andrew. I came to judge your temperament and attitude, and have found the answer I seek. You'll lose your head on the morrow and be sent back to your family to be buried alongside your ancestors. I hope the rest of your house shows more cleverness than you have thus far, for otherwise your burial will be the last act they carry out on those lands." "You would harm my family?" Sir Andrew said with anger, though there was much worry in his tone, too. "No more than you have by your actions. They'll be given a chance to prove themselves true, you, however. Well, I'd trust not anything you say. I go to my gods, happily." Sir Andrew said defiantly. "Then you truly are the fool I believe you to be, Sir Andrew. Trust me, when mine own time comes, they'll need to drag me from this world, kicking and screaming, for death is not something that any man should welcome." After leaving the cells, Varys made his way back to the king's chambers and arrived to find that Davos and the king were both inside and speaking on matters of the realm. Taking a seat when offered, he spoke on his thoughts about what needed to be done with those who'd survived the battle, and found the king and Davos were both in agreement. From there, it was to even more talk on the realm itself. Varys took a moment to inform the king that all they'd reached out to had answered with haste and with force. Sir David he named as a good man and true, while doing the same for Sir Morton Waynwood too. While Imyr Tully had not sent men, he had offered them, but both Varys and Davos had felt it for the best, if the Lord of River Run sat this particular fight out. Whatever ill feeling there was between the Tully lord and his niece, there was no need for them to put him in such a difficult position as to have to be among the men who led to her death. It was something that the king agreed with most readily. Varys was pleased to hear. When talk then turned to the condition of the realm, the state of each kingdom, the king was most pleased by what they told them. The coin and supplies from Essos had been most welcomed and put to use. Dorne, the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale all had benefited most from the food supplies at first. Aegon asked him why the Stormlands had not, and Varys briefly worried they'd been wrong in what they'd done, only to find his reasoning was thought to be sound by the king. "We offered, your grace, but I believe that Edric Storm wished to paint the crown in a certain light so as to help his cause. Now, I find I'm most happy that he did so." "For why, Lord Varys?" Aegon asked curiously. "For the new lady, your grace, Lady Maya, will be even more welcomed should she bring peace and prosperity to the Stormlands, and should she do so quickly. We have already put aside a large stock of food and supplies that are ready to be distributed there, and that can arrive soon after the lady herself. And Lady Maya, how ready is she for the responsibility we're placing on her shoulders? In some ways, not at all. Your grace." "Lord Varys," Aegon said as Varys sighed. "Somewhat like yourself, your grace. Lady Maya never expected to hold such a lofty position, yet her upbringing in some ways is most beneficial, as your grace's was too." "Because she was never accepted as noble," Aegon said. And Varys nodded. "It allows for a perspective that is sorely lacking, your grace. The Lordians, your own, her graces and those who follow you. All of you know much about the suffering of the small folk. So all of you seek to make their lives better. We seek to break the wheel, Lord Varys. My wife's greatest wish is to do so." "Indeed, your grace, yet the wheel turns still and will take time before it can be broken." "Davos," Aegon asked. "I agree with Lord Varys, your grace. We've spoken much on Lady Mania, and the one thing we're sure of is that, with the right husband, she can and will be the best thing for the Stormlands." Varys saw how the king's expression changed. A dark look quickly came over his face at the mention of the woman in question being wed, and it took him a moment to realize just why that was. "We'll not force her, your grace. We'll offer a list of suitable men or those we deem suitable and let the lady decide for herself." "Why does she need to wed at all?" Aegon asked, thankfully more with curiosity than anything else in his tone. "Other than to continue the line and birth an heir, the lady needs to be married, your grace. She needs to have a noble husband to stop any questions as to her suitability to be Lady Paramount." "And what qualities deem a man suitable, Davos, Lord Varys? What more than a name grants a man a place on your list? I assure you, your grace, that it is far more than a name we seek. I'd see the lady happy if I'm able, your grace. On that you have my vow." "Aye, your grace, we seek not to wed the lady to a man not worthy of her." "You know me better than that, I'd hope," Davos added. I do. Forgive me, I meant not to question your motives, either of you." Aegon said, looking first at Davos and then at him. "There is naught to forgive, your grace. We make it clear that it's the lady, not her husband, who rules, Davos. That she is the one with the power, not he. Should the man chosen prove himself to be unsuitable, then I'd seek to give Lady Maya the power to deal with him. Of course, your grace, and I wish to speak to the lady in private too. She'll arrive on the morrow?" Aegon asked. "All things being well, she will. Your grace." "Good. I intend to leave the day after." "Is there much left to do, your grace?" Davos asked, and Aegon shook his head. "If things have gone according to plan, then Loras will have sworn to my wife and sister, and I'll meet them before they reach Pentos. And after Pentos, Ybern and the 3 daughters, Davos, and then it's done," Aegon said happily. The next morning, Varys stood on the dock and welcomed Maya Stone to King's Landing. Despite looking nervous, the girl seemed excited to be there. After greeting her warmly, they rode in a carriage back to the Red Keep, and the girl asked many questions which showed she had as bright a mind as Varys had hoped to find. Though it was impossible to judge a person from one meeting, Varys believed that she'd prove herself loyal and true. He hoped she did. Any who did not would soon find a king and queen back in the lands they ruled over, and it had taken but one dragon to bring the last man who'd played them false to his knees and his gods. Soon we'll have 4, Varys thought happily, as he and Miles Stone walked into the Red Keep. Pentos 307 AC. John Connington. He arrived at Pentos with the first of the ships, acting as an emissary more than an invader. With the flag of the Emperor and Empress of Essos now flying over their ships, they faced no trouble on the sea or at the docks. Jon was almost welcomed rather than looked at with fear, and as he and his men walked down the gangplank, he knew that they'd face no true danger here. Pentos had never truly had an army to call upon and had always used negotiation and coin rather than brute force to repel its enemies. In some ways, it would be doing so once again. Though unless Daenerys and Rhaenys left here as the city's rulers, all their efforts would fail. Down through streets where people looked at him both warily and hopefully, Jon was brought to one of the larger manses where a group of magisters already awaited his arrival. Among the fat men that looked his way as Jon took his seat was the so-called Prince of Pentos, a poor misguided fool that accepted a life of luxury while knowing that in the blink of an eye that life and his own could be taken from him. A bad harvest, a drought, storms at sea, or invaders seeking more than Pentos was willing to give, and the so-called prince would meet his end, an end that would be bloody and painful, and to Jon's mind not worth the few moons or even years of privilege that the man would know before then. Pentos had already somewhat come under their control. Letters had been sent, and though it would take Daenerys herself to do the actual negotiation, Jon was here as her emissary, and so what that negotiation would entail would be what he spoke of. Looking at the fat men opposite him, it seemed that they understood this somewhat, and so Jon wasted no more time than was needed. "You know who sent me here," he stated. "King Aegon and Queen Daenerys." "The Emperor and Empress of Essos," Jon corrected, forcing the fat men to look at each other. "We've heard them named as such, though knew not they named themselves in such a way. What other name could they be known by?" "Magister. Does not most of Essos swear to them, and their daughter already? Bravos, Volantis, Mantares, Mirain, Astapor, Yonkai, Karth, and even Lorath now all bow to the dragons and abide by their rules." "What of Norvos?" a magister asked, ignoring what Jon had just said. "Even here in Pentos, you saw the blood moon, did you not?" he asked to nods of heads. Nard too saw it, and then allied with the man who brought it to their shores. The man who named himself the Bloodstone Emperor Reborn, Bellico Stakenout. "Be thankful that he fell to the Emperor's own blade, for trust me, you'd not wish to face the fate that the Nartu did under his rule." Needing them to understand it even more clearly, Jon spent the next few moments telling the tale of the battle his king, queen, princess, and their army had won. A battle unlike any he'd ever imagined, and one that he was sure no one other than the Targaryens could have won. He told of how Norvos was practically a ghost city when they finally reached it, and how Bellico had put every man, woman, and child to the sword, though in truth it was even worse things than that which the so-called Bloodstone Emperor had inflicted on the people of Norvos. When he was done, the expressions on the Magister's face ranged from shock to relief. Shock that any man could end a city so completely, and relief that Aegon and Daenerys had stopped Bellico from doing so to any others. Their own city most of all being at the forefront of their minds, Jon had no doubt. When he told them that the Empress, the princesses, and the rest of their fleet along with the dragons would be arriving within days, Jon knew he had them. Adding that Aegon, too, would be joining his wife and daughter here only reinforced that perception in Jon's mind. What are the Empress and Emperor's terms? As with every city that we've welcomed into the Empire's embrace, our terms are far more favorable than what refusing them would bring to you, Jon said, repeating something he'd heard Aegon say. That night he ate well and slept in a comfortable bed. The Magisters had agreed wholeheartedly and without reservation to their terms. Led by Illyrio Mopatis, they had been only too happy to do so. For the next few days, supplies were gathered both for Westeros and even more importantly for their fleet. Jon knew full well that from Pentos it was to the three daughters that his king and queen intended to sail. Lysmere and Tyrosh along with Ibn were the last of the remaining free cities of Essos, and just the thought of that alone was enough to make Jon smile, a true smile. 2 years to bring an entire continent to T-heel. Had they not needed to deal with Bellico Stegon then, it could have been done even more quickly. In one swoop almost, Aegon and Daenerys had done more than the Conqueror and his sister wives had. They'd certainly taken more land and far more wealth than was gained in the conquest. Jon wondered if they'd face a truer fight with the three daughters, or if in the future one of the former free cities would think themselves brave enough to pull on the dragon's tail. In his conversations with Aegon, Jon had been told that before his king and queen rested, they'd leave a world free of war behind them. That their daughter would never know the life that both of them had been forced to live. It had been a noble thought and one that Jon had wished to see come true with all his heart. Just not one that he'd believed with. Now, here today, standing at the docks as the rest of their fleet and the Queen's flagship sailed in the bay, and as he looked to see 3 dragons in the sky, Jon believed it to be a dream that had a chance of succeeding. Later, as he looked to see the green dragon landing and its rider being welcomed by his wife and daughter, Jon believed it to be a dream worthy of whatever remained of his life. King's Landing, 3007 AC. Mayu Stone. Losing Michael had sent her into a malaise. He'd broken her heart and, worst of all, he didn't seem to care that he'd done so. All the things he'd told her and the promises he'd made to her had been forgotten. The plans they'd spoken about for the future they'd have together were simply abandoned so he could cast her to the side and marry Yaxley Royce. It had proved the truth of him and of men like him, show that their bravery was but a myth and that they cared not for their hearts as much as they did for their position. Moxley would have been happy to simply be wed to the man she loved. If Moxley had truly felt the same, then that should have been enough for him too. And yet it was not, so for moons, a year, she had wallowed and decried the truth of her birth and her status, only to then find that because of who she'd been born as, who her father was, there was a chance to rise even higher than Matsiar Redford had ever dared to dream. Not that she got her hopes up too much, for life had already shown her what happened when she did that. Still, she did dare to dream, and so, when the letter came and was followed by the guards to take her to Galltown and then on to King's Landing, Matsiar was only too happy to say goodbye to the Vale and embark on a new stage of her life. Along with her mother, they were treated far better than either of them had ever been before as they traveled. The best of food, a cabin of their own, all of it allowing Mia to dare to dream again. Knowing it was the new king and queen that had reached out to her and made her the offer of a new and better life, allowed too for Mia to believe that she was not being played falsely. For even in the Vale, she'd heard many tales of the former Jon Snow and of Daenerys Targaryen, a queen who had spent her life on the run from those who'd sought her death, and a king who had for most of his life believed himself to be a bastard. The latter of those two things was something that truly intrigued Mia, as surely Jon Snow would understand the weight of carrying such a burden on your shoulders. How, even more than being low-born, being base-born was a true crutch to bear. Laying in her bed, Mia thought back to some of the tales she'd heard about Winterfell and the battle that was fought there. She allowed her mind to wander to how the king and queen were celebrated by those few men of the Vale who had returned from the north. The king is a good man and true, while the queen is both a lady and very much not. I've seen him sit and eat with wildlings, with men of the north, while the queen spent much time amongst those savage horse lords of hers. They don't blame people for the sins of their father. I heard a tale told that King Aegon refused to take lands from House Karstark and House Umber because the heads of those houses were children. Their fathers may have been evil men, their brothers, uncles, or whoever, but they were children and all children are innocent. Maya had spoken of her worries and hopes only with her mother. She'd asked for her advice and whether or not it was because her mother could see just how much Mayeso's betrayal had hurt her, or the offer was just too good to turn down. That advice had been to grab it with both hands. Something that Maya had done, and she would soon know just how true and sincere the offer had been. Not that she doubted it or the spirit it was offered in, just simply because she knew better now how the world truly worked. Closing her eyes, she was soon asleep, and she dreamt of being the lady of a great house, of a husband who loved her and she, him, and of the children they'd one day have. Maya dreamt of a life of comfort and where any hardship that came her way was one she was in a far better position to face. A life where she wasn't looked down upon because of who and what she was. Waking early the next morning, it was to find they were now in Blackwater Bay, and by the time she'd dressed and broken her fast, the ship was already docking. "Are you ready for this, Mother?" she asked as together they walked up onto the deck. "If you are, sweetling." Nodding that she was, they walked out onto the deck and down the gangplank to the docks. Standing there, a large group of guards, wearing red and black, awaited them, as did a bald-headed man wearing a colorful robe. "Welcome to King's Landing, Lady Maya, Lady Mara. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Lord Varys. Their Graces, Master of Whisperers, our carriage awaits." The bald-headed man, Lord Varys, as he'd named himself, said as he bid Maya and her mother to follow him. Showing as few nerves as she dared to, Maya took her mother's arm and they followed after Lord Varys to the carriage. They'd only just reached it when she caught sight of the green dragon as it flew over her head, and both she and her mother almost dropped to the ground in their fright. "Rig will harm you not, my ladies," Lord Varys said as reassuringly as he could, and so Maya steeled herself and helped her mother into the carriage before she quickly joined her. The ride to what she had found out was to be the Red Keep was one done with few questions. Lord Varys asked had their travel been comfortable and informed them that the king wished to hold a private meeting with Maya once she was settled. Firstly, it was to be the hand of the king that would speak to them both and clarify the true extent of the offer she was being made, along with the conditions of that offer. Something that sent a warning bell off in Maya's head, though she kept her counsel for now. When the carriage stopped, she and her mother were helped out, and Maya stared awestruck at the Red Keep. It was a look she bore all the way to the Tower of the Hand, as she found herself looking at the tapestries and depictions of House Targaryen through the years. The tapestries depicted scenes from the conquest to the dance and beyond, or so Lord Varys told her mother when she'd asked about some of them. Feeling her nerves threaten to overwhelm her when they reached the Hand's rooms, Maya was more than glad of the comfort of her mother's hand in her own. Lord Davos is a good man, Lady Maya. The Hand was born in Flea Bottom, and as do you and your mother, he too knows full well what the life of small folk entails. Yet he is hand of the king and queen? Maisie asked, doubtfully, wondering if Lord Varys was playing some game she understood. Not, and even if he was telling the truth. Maisie simply not understanding how a man born in Fleasy Bottom could rise so high. He serves a better king and queen than we've known in many a year, Lady Maya. A king and queen that looks at the heart of the man or woman in front of them and looks at their character and not their name or upbringing. Lord Varys said proudly. A moment later they were led into the room, and the man who sat at a table working on papers seemed old and, given his swearing, was certainly as low-born as Maya's or her mother were. Chuckling despite her nerves, Lord Varys introduced them, and they were bid to take a seat. Food was sent for them, though neither was hungry, and the man across from them introduced himself as Davos Seaworth, the hand to the king and queen. I can only imagine the whirlwind this may seem to you both, so I beg your forgiveness for that. Lady Mara, your daughter is aware of who her father was, Davos asked. She is, Lord Handher, her mother answered nervously as Davos nodded and bid her to call him by his name. Daenerys, my lady, Daenerys said, offering them both a warm smile. I'll not go into too much detail about your father, Lady Mara. Suffice to say, you were not the only child born to him outside of the wedding bed. However, there are few of you left alive. I'm sorry to say, they died? She asked to a shake Davos's head. They were killed? King Joffrey was a cruel man, Lady Maya. He sought to remove every last one of your father's other children from the world, and he almost succeeded. 4 were all he'd missed out on. 1, a son who lost his life only a few days past in an idiotic effort to make himself king. A daughter, Bella, who we've reached out to and offered a better life in the north. A son, Gendry, who is wed to the Warden of the North, Arya Stark, and who is father to a young son. And you, Lady Maya, brothers and sisters. She'd had brothers and sisters, and still had one of each. The thought brought a smile to her face, and when she asked if she could contact them, Davos had said he'd see a letter delivered to her brother in the north. I don't write so good, Lord Davos, Maya said shamefully. In time we'll help you fix that, Lady Maya. Though your brother isn't someone who writes well either, as am I not, Davos said, handing her a piece of parchment that proved his words true and made her feel less shamed by her lack of education. You keep naming my daughter and me as ladies, we're not. You are, Lady Mara, both of you. The position we seek you to take grants you that title. Lady Maya Durrandon, the Lady of Storm's End and Lady Paramount of the Stormlands. Maya gasped. She reached for her mug and drained the water from it. She was to be legitimized. Nothing said to her so far had spoken of such. She'd not even dared to dream such a thing was ever to be hers. Somehow fighting back the tears that threatened to fall, Maya looked at Davos and asked him to confirm what he'd just said. Aye, Lady Maya, we would seek you to take the name of your new house, and never again shall that house be named Baratheon before House Baratheon. It was House Durrandon that ruled the Stormlands, and so it shall be again. Lord Varys said there would be conditions. Lord Davos, could you tell me what they are? She asked nervously. 3 hours later, once again she'd accepted without hesitation. Maya had barely heard what Davos had said regarding the husband she'd need to marry. All she'd heard was that it was true. She was to be Lady of the Stormlands, the head of her very own house. Never again would she or her mother need to worry about food on their table or be forced to accept every slight that was aimed their way. Not that they'd ever gone hungry. mind, though there had been more than enough slights over the years for it to almost become an accepted way of life for them both. Davos had shown her a book with images of Storm's End, and Maya had been stunned and shocked to find that it was all truly to be hers. Later, once the meeting was done with, Maya and her mother were taken to rooms that were far better than any either of them had ever seen, let alone stayed in. There was clothing in the wardrobes for them both to wear, and of a quality that neither of them had seen, but on the noblest ladies of the Vale. Dresses that Maya could never see herself wearing, along with other clothing that she very much could. Still, when the knock came on her door to take her to meet the king, Maya wore the same clothes that she had worn since arriving. She was even more nervous than she had been earlier as she walked down the corridors and looked at the sheer number of guards that were on duty. Down one flight of stairs, up another, and then to her surprise, it was to the roof and not some rooms that she was taken to. "His Grace awaits you outside," the white-cloaked one-handed guard said to her, and as he opened the door, Maya breathed in as deeply as she could. Out on the roof, the king stood armed and armored. Though there was no sign of the White Wolf that she had heard so much about, Ghost, as for the man himself, he was not much older than Maya. She'd wager, dark of hair and gray of eye, scarred though not hideously so. Aegon Targaryen looked like a true warrior king, which, given all he'd done since being crowned, was not a true surprise. "Your Grace," Maya said, as she did a bad attempt at a curtsy. "Lady Maya, forgive me for meeting you here, and not in my chambers. I was taking a last look at the city before I depart." "You're leaving, Your Grace. My wife and daughter are waging war in Essos, Lady Maya. They and my sister, and while I have no fears, or few fears if I'm being more truthful, until I'm with them and can embrace them with mine own arms, my worries will not be assuaged." "Will you be gone for long, Your Grace?" she asked curiously. "Hopefully not, for there is still much to do in Westeros, and my wife and I have left our work to others for long enough." Speaking of which, Axon moved his hand and bid her join him, and so Maya walked toward him far more assuredly than she'd believed she'd have been able to. "I wanted to speak to you on our offer, Lady Maya, to hopefully put your mind and heart at rest over some of it. Your Grace, Lord Davos no doubt spoke to you of a wedding match." "He did," Maya replied, not able to look the king in the eye. "It would be one we'd seek you to have as much say in as possible, Lady Maya. We wish not to force you to wed against your will." "Your Grace, do you know much of my story, Lady Maya, of who my mother was and her connection to your father?" "I've heard some, Your Grace." "Then let me tell you the true tale, as best I know it." Maya listened as she was told of a betrothal that was wished for not, a lady who accepted it not, and a man who named it as what it was not. Again spoke of his mother being rebellious and opinionated, and of her father and brothers, all bar one, not listening to her concerns and so not adhering to her wishes. How it had then led to his mother and father meeting and to all that had eventually entailed. When he spoke of her father, Maya recognized the tone from how her mother would speak of him on the few occasions that she would do so. At the end of his tale, again turned to her, reached out and placed his hand on her shoulders. "I'll force no woman to wed, Lady Maya. None. I give you my oath on that." His dark gray eyes looked deep into her blue ones. And never had Maya seen such resolve ever before. "Lord Davos," Maya asked, "we'll provide you with a list of men suitable from the Stormlands. Allow you to meet them in your own time, and should you find one of them to be a man you can accept, then we'd seek you to wed that man. Should you not, then all we demand is that when you do eventually wed, we must approve." "So you know I'm loyal?" she whispered. "And so we know he's a man worthy of you," Aegon replied, stunning her with how firmly he said it. "Aye, my lady, why, Your Grace, why care for my happiness at all? You offer me more than I can ever refuse, so why?" Maya choked back tears that she barely held at bay. "We share blood, Lady Maya. Your father forgot that or cared for it not. Yet, that's only part of it, if I speak true. Your brother, Gendry, he's wed to my sister. Some would say that makes us kin. Some would not," she sniffled. "Oh, there are fools still in the world." Aegon japped, making her chuckle. "I would see you happy because it's what my wife would wish for you. What my sister would. It's what I would wish for you. I could name someone else in your stead, buy their loyalty, and they'd probably even give it to me cheaply and truly. You don't wish to buy mine own. I wish to earn it, Lady Maya. I wish for the people of the Stormlands to be led by someone who knows what it is to be given a second chance at life." For in the end, that's what we've all been given, is it not? We wish you to be our Lady Paramount, for you to have the power, and we'll do all we can to see this is not a burden. You bear alone, should you wish it not, then we'll find a different life for your mother and for you. A good life. Though should it be what you wish, then I've no doubt it'll be a life you come to realize that you were born for. I'm scared, your grace, truly scared, she said, sighing deeply. That's the only time we can truly be brave, Maya. The king and his guards along with the green dragon left later that night. Maya, however, stayed on in King's Landing for 3 more days. When she did leave the city, it was with men of the Stormlands who had been released and who were now traveling back to their homes, as well as with an escort of guards and servants that were given to her by the hand of the king. Some were there to help her settle into her new life and to make sure that no one sought to cheat or oppose her, while others were simply like Maya herself and were looking for a fresh start in a new place. In her pack, she carried a list of men who Lord Varys and Lord Davos had assured her were the best possible matches in the Stormlands. Men who both held a high enough position to further legitimize her claim and who, according to the Master of Whisperers, were of a good enough character so as to make them worthy. Yet it was the last words that the king had spoken to her before leaving that truly gave her the strength of will to do what she needed to do. You are who we named to rule, Lady Maya. You're the one with the power, not those that serve you or any man who you chose to take for a husband. You remember that, and the rest comes easy. Or as easy as it can. Maya swore that she'd remember it well. Pentos 307 AC. Daenerys Targaryen. Originally, Dany had planned to arrive in Pentos atop Drogon. She and Rhaenys had discussed it, and along with her good sister riding Balerion, Dany had felt that to be for the best. Jon Connington, along with Jorah, had, however, managed to persuade her to do things differently. So instead, Drogon, Balerion, and Lorax all flew over their heads as Dany stood on deck with Rhaella in her arms and with Rhaenys and Missandei by her side. They'd already received the signal from Jon Connington and from the ship he'd left further out in the bay, which told them they faced no danger or threat here. The city had surrendered and welcomed the chance to be brought into their empire peacefully. All that now remained was for Dany and Rhaenys to meet with the Magisters, for them to resupply, and hopefully for Aegon to join them before they sailed on to the deal with the 3 daughters. Dany was not the only one hoping that the latter of those things would happen today. Papa, not here, Mama, Rox said sadly, and Dany moved her head so that she was looking her daughter in her violet eyes, tears glistening in her own, and thankfully not in her daughter's. They'll be here soon, little dragon, she said, tickling Raxlia to make her laugh, happy to hear the sound, and once again praying to any god who would listen so that they'd prove her words true. It had been less than a moon and yet had felt like an eternity to them both. Donna missed the warm embrace of her husband as much as she missed seeing him play with their daughter. While for Rosiella time seemed to go on for so much longer than it truly did. Happier now that her daughter was once again content, Donna turned and nodded to Jorah and Brienne before she then made her way down to her cabin. Missandei took Rosiella from her arms and Donna watched them play some game or other as she dressed and put on her armor. Pentos may have agreed to join their empire, but that didn't mean there would not be some fool who'd try to earn some glory by killing the Dragon Queen or some other foolish act. Once she was ready, Daenerys worked a ghost who had been roped into playing Rogeria's game, and she smiled warmly at the sight. Only after speaking to Jon Connington herself would she see her daughter brought from the ship, and so with a look to Brienne, Dany turned and walked from the cabin. Jorah took his place at her back and was joined by Ned Dane, while Rhaegira once again took her place at her side. Together they walked up onto the deck and down the gangplank to where Jon Connington awaited. In the sky above, 3 dragons flew much lower now in a show of force and of warning. Yet looking around the docks and to the rooftops and windows nearest them, Dainty could see no threat. "My queen," Jon Connington said, taking a knee. "Arise, Lord Jon. Pentos is yours, my queen. All your terms have been agreed to without question. And how truly do we accept the word of those who agreed to our terms, Lord Jon? As truly as we can, my queen." Dany looked to Rhaenys, who nodded, and then to Lady Kinvara and Lady Melora, who disembarked from their own ships. Neither her good sister nor either of the 2 ladies seemed to doubt Lord Jon's words, and so Dany would not either. Not that she didn't trust the man to be loyal and true. He'd shown them as much after all. She knew, though, just how duplicitous these magisters could be, and remembered well her own time in this city. as she did the man whose manse she'd been a guest at for some time. "Magister Illyrio," she asked, "has requested a meeting, my queen. And accommodations have been secured?" "They have." They rode through the city on horses rather than dragons' backs. Rosier and Missandei were in a covered carriage surrounded by Unsullied and with Brienne and Ghost riding alongside it, while Dany rode atop a dark stallion that had been gifted to her by Aegon. In the windows of the buildings they passed, people looked and some even waved. Not a single one tried to fire an arrow or attack them in some fashion. And Dany began to wonder if they actually welcomed being brought into their empire. Did they feel that under their rule they'd fare better than they had under the Magisters and the so-called prince? Or was it simply that they feared the dragon's flames and so took comfort that it had been words and not a battle that had taken the city? As long as they accepted it, in the end, it mattered not. Gossané almost rolled her eyes when she saw the manse they'd been given. She knew full well who had once owned it and wondered if some unsubtle message was being sent to her, or mayhap to Aegon. Had it not been for the fact that Jon Connington had already secured the manse, then she'd have sought another one to house them. As it was, despite the manse having once belonged to Drogo, Dany rode in through the gates, and so for the short amount of time she'd hopefully spend in this city, this would be their home. In less than an hour they were settled. There were some decorations displayed throughout the manse that spoke of its former owner. Paintings, tapestries, and statues of horses and the great stallion, though to her relief there was none of Drogo himself. When Dany asked Jon who chose the manse, she was relieved to find it had been him and that he'd picked it for its size, location, and defensibility. Then with that knowledge in mind, she'd spent her first day just enjoying being on firm ground once more, and watching her daughter as she played her games with a white wolf and a red dragon. "Rex," Rosier called out happily. Another new name she had come up with for the red dragon. Dainty watched her daughter from the window as Jon Connington spoke more on his meeting with the Magisters, and Lady Kinvara spoke of her own meeting with the priests and priestess of the Red Temple. "None have found any ulterior motive in the Magisters kneeling, my queen," Lady Kinvara said, and Dany reluctantly turned away from the window and back to those in the room. "I've seen nothing to cause me any worries through any of my familiars, your grace," Lady Melora began before she then added something which made Dainsert race a little. "I have seen His Grace leave Westeros. However, I believe he'll arrive before night falls." "My brother is well?" Rosier asked concernedly. "Most well, my princess. Lord Jon arranged for a full meeting with the Magisters on the morrow and a private meeting with Illyrio Mopatis to follow. As you command, my queen. Lady Melora, my husband, will he arrive before we eat? If we delay the nightly meal for an hour or so, I believe His Grace will have arrived by then. Your Grace." "Very well," Dany said, hiding her own excitement at the thoughts that she'd see Aegon before the night was done, that he'd be back with her in Reriala. The wait seemed to be endless, even though it was but a few hours. Ghost was the first to alert her that a Aegon was near, followed by Lyaire Hax, and then by Dragon and Balerion. Rhaella was tired but awake, hungry but not irritable, and when her daughter saw Ghost's ears prick up, her own excitement soon forced her tiredness away. "Papa, Papa," Rhaella said, running to her. "Come, little dragon, let's go greet your father." "Shall we?" "Papa, I come," Rhaella shouted as Dany lifted her up and took her in her arms. Whether it had been for Drogo's horses, or so that his blood riders and others could simply sleep out in the open, the manse had far more large, empty spaces than Illyrio's or any of the other manses had. It was to one of them that Daki, Rhaella, Reimagined, and Ned Dane, Ghost, Jara, and Brienne now made their way to. They were soon joined by Jon Connington, Lady Melora, and Lady Kinvara. "Minzine and Grey Worm are off doing many things," Dany thought wickedly, as she now pictured doing much the same with her husband. Holding a now very excited Rosial in her arms, Dany looked to the sky to see Rosial for the first time in a number of weeks. Looking at the figures on the green dragon's back, she could see Tormund, Jaime Lannister, and Aegon himself. None of them seemed wounded or hurt to Dany's eyes, and this was proven even more true when they landed. "Papa!" Rhaella shouted out loudly, Dany waiting until Aegon had climbed down off Rhaella's back before she let her daughter free and allowed her to run to her father. The sight of Rhaella's little legs as she raced as fast as she could was only beaten by the sound of her excited and happy yelp when Aegon grabbed her and took her in his arms. Both her husband and her daughter then fought with each other to see who could lay the most kisses to whose cheek. "Papa, my little dragon, missed you, little dragon." Miss you, Papa. Wiping her eyes and stopping the happy tears from flowing, Dany moved to join in with the joyful reunion she'd been witness to. The look Aegon gave her when she walked toward him was more than enough to tell her that he'd missed her as much as she had him. Though he still spoke the words after he'd kissed her as deeply as he could without crushing Rhaella between them. Gods, I missed you. So much. Both of you. Aegon said as he kissed her again before kissing their daughter's cheek once more. All went well, Sansa? We'll speak of her later, my love. I care not to think of her here and now, Aegon said before moving to whisper in her ear. All went well, though, I promise. Aegon bid Tormund and Jaime Lannister get some rest, and he was more than happy to find that they'd not eaten yet. With Rosalie in his arms and holding Dainty by the hand, he thanked Rosiel before bidding the Green Dragon to go eat and rest. Dainty did likewise while welcoming her son back to where he belonged at the same time. From the Green Dragon, it was to his sister that Aegon next moved to, and Dainty and most reluctant Rosiel from his arms, so that Aegon could greet Rosiel how he wished. Papa needs to say hello to Auntie Rhaenys. Papa, no go, Rel asked, worriedly. No, little dragon, Papa, no go, Aegon said, looking over his shoulder before he then embraced his sister. Rosiella, unsurprisingly, was only too keen to be taken back into her father's arms, while Aegon reached out his hand to take Dainty's own. Together they walked into the manse and to their room, Aegon only letting Dainty's hand loose from his own so that he could rub Ghost's fur and thank the White Wolf for protecting them both. As soon as he did so, it was again her hand that he reached out for, and which Dainty gave him gladly. Both of them, it seemed, needed the contact and feel of each other, just to prove that they were here, and that it was not some dream or other they were sharing. In their room, Aegon changed in how he did so while playing hide-and-seek with Raoden. Dany knew not. Dany had taken a seat on their bed and watched the game as more and more of Aegon's body was revealed. Her thoughts went from wholesome as she watched her husband play with their daughter to anything but as she saw at least some of his naked body while wishing it was time for her to see more of it. They ate their dinner as a family, and with all their advisors and closest companions, Rosiella sat on Aegon's lap and ate from his plate. Though only when her father made her eat, other than saying that the threat of Edric's storm was no longer something that concerned them. Aegon spoke little about what had happened in Westeros. Dany was eager to know more, and yet, each time she looked at Aegon, he simply shook his head and mouthed that they'd speak later. In the end, it was much later when they did get to speak for true, and Dany worried that her husband was hiding his true feelings, when he then spoke of what had happened as they readied for bed. I've made my peace with it, Dany. Truly, I have. I gave her more chances than she deserved. I hate her for what she made me do. Yet it wasn't my hand that took her from this world, or my actions. I'm just relieved that it was dealt with so easily, and no one else was harmed by the spoilt and selfish girl she truly was. She was your sister, Aegon. Your family. She was never my sister, Aegon said before stopping himself. Not in her heart, Dean. Never there. In mine own, that girl died long ago. And the girl Sansa became, she was nothing to me. Aegon, I'm well, Dany. Truly, I'm with you and Rhea. I have Rhaenys and Arya, Robb. I have the family I deserve. The family I've always wanted. Nothing else matters other than that. Come to bed, my love. Come to bed, for I've missed you so, she said, changing the subject to one that, given the look in Aegon's eye, he was more than happy for. I've missed you too, Dany. I've missed you so much, Aegon said as he began to kiss and caress her. Dany just murmuring contentedly as he did so, and as the touches and caresses began to fuel the passions that now burned inside them both. Pentos 307 AC. Aegon Targaryen. He and Dany had coupled twice. Firstly, hungrily, both of them had shown their need for each other, as clearly as if they shouted the words out loudly for all to hear. The second time was more slowly, more sensual, and even more enjoyable. Later, they'd simply held each other and spoke of things that Aegon had truly wished not to. Sansa was gone from the world, and he wagered that after tonight, or mayhap tomorrow, he'd never speak or even think of her again. He certainly had no wish to. Once Dany had drifted off to sleep, Aegon found that as tired as he was, he could not. Instead, he rose quietly and moved carefully from the bed, so as to not disturb his wife. He then placed a kiss on Dany's forehead before moving to Rosiella's room. He'd been gone for less than a moon, only a couple of weeks all told, Yet, looking at his daughter as she slept, Aegon felt he'd missed far too much of her growing up. It was a silly thought, a stupid one really, but one he felt all the same. Watching Rhaella sleep, seeing the little expressions she made as she dreamt what to Aegon, looked like happy dreams. He felt as content as he had ever wished to be. Looking to Ghost, who lay at the end of his daughter's bed and watched over her, Aegon thanked the White Wolf for doing so while he could not, and after a short while he left his daughter to her dreams. To his surprise, when he snuck back to his Ep19's room and climbed into their bed, sleep came to him almost immediately, and he slept until he was woken by a very excited little girl bouncing on his chest, almost. "Papa! Papa! I dream you!" Rosier said happily, as her little fingers opened his eyes to the world. "You did, little dragon." "I shoo, Papa," Rosie added, making him chuckle and finally waking Dany. "Come, Papa, play me." "It's too early, little dragon," Aegon said, as Dany wiped the sleep from her eyes. "No early. Look. Son awake, Papa awake. After we eat, Rosier," Tasang said, and Rosier looked from her mother to Aegon before seeming to ponder the suggestion, and finally deciding, "Eat, then play." "Mama." "Eat, then play," he said, earning a smile and a hug that made the forced awakening more than worth it. Aegon played a small little game with Raxalia while Dany dressed before his wife, then took over and allowed him to put on his own clothing, chasing Raxalia from the room, while Ghost looked at them both as if to say it was much too early for such a thing. Aegon found himself laughing truly when they reached the room they'd take their morning meal in and found Raxalia and Ned Dane were both already up and awake. Hearing his daughter proclaim to her aunt and uncle that she had won their little race, as well as the proud look on Raxalia as she spoke the words, was more than enough reason for that laughter. They ate. Rosier sat on his lap and picked from his plate, and then once they had, it was to the garden of the manse where they played some of the games that Aegon remembered from his childhood, games he'd played to amuse Arya or take his little sister's mind off something that Sansa and her friends had said to or about her. Not one game that he'd ever played with Sansa did Aegon share with his daughter, though in truth there had been so few that he wasn't quite sure if he remembered any of them. Eventually, all the game-playing tired Rosiata, and so when Rosiado bid his daughter come and be taken up in her arms, Rosiata was only too happy to be lifted and held by her aunt. It allowed for Aegon and Dany to speak more about Pentos and the meeting with the Magisters, and one man in particular, a man that Dany knew all too well, and who Aegon was unsure about. Illyrio Maupetit, looking to where Rhaemy sat with Ned Dane, and spoke softly to a clearly tired Rosiata. Aegon and Dany stood far enough away from them so as to speak without interruption, yet close enough to be seen should Rosiata turn to look for them. "You know the man better than I, Dany, though I must say I like not what you've told me of him. He's like all the Magisters, Aegon. They seek to fill their coffers and grow their wealth, and Illyrio used Viserys and me to do so. He sold you like a broodmare, Dany. My brothers sold me, Aegon. Illyrio just helped him do so. He was kind to us too, to me. Aye, but for what reason? Profit." Aegon sneered. "A man who seeks such is a man we can control. Yakin. We could kill him, strip him of his wealth, and make an example of him. But would it not be for the best if we are not seen to be vindictive, that we're seen to be just and fair? We're just and fair, but as I said, you know him better than I do. If this is what you think, then I'll forgo my own wish to gut the fat man." "Aegon, I jest a little," he said, smiling at his wife. They didn't meet with the Magisters that day, instead waiting until the next to do so. During the meeting, Aegon held his tongue and watched as Dany put them all in their place. Once it was over and done with, his wife and he then spoke to Illyrio Maupetit. Aegon again said nothing and allowed Dany to both thank the Magister and then warn him, a warning that the man seemed to take to heart. Back at their manse, they held a war meeting of sorts, and spoke on what was left to do, Haben, the 3 daughters, and the stepstones. Aegon was surprised to find that, on 2 of those things, their simply existing would see that no battle would need to be fought. Though it seemed that bringing the 3 daughters into the Empire would require at least one more battle. "Matter readies itself for the fight, Your Grace," Lady Kinvora said as Aegon looked to Melora, who nodded. "As too does Tyrosh, and lies," he asked, "watches with an eager eye, my prince," Lady Melora said, Eben and the Stepstones too. You believe they'll choose to come willingly once we deal with Mir and Tyrosh, Lady Melora? I do, my prince. As do I, your grace, Lady Kinvara added. Then let us make ready to set sail. One more battle, and then we can rest. Axley said, looking to Dany, who nodded determinedly. Then we can all rest. Axley said, thinking of his daughter and the world that he and her mother were fashioning for her. It would be a world where this was as close to war as Rhaella would ever know. One where Thorne's words about fighting their battle forever would never apply to his daughter, where the only need for flying atop a dragon would be for pleasure and for the joy it brought. Rugen and Dany had known a lifetime of struggle and warfare. They'd grown up without the love of their parents, without them being there to soothe every pain or welcome every smile. One more moon, and that world would no longer exist. It may not have been the wheel that Dany had wished to break when she arrived in Westeros, but it was a wheel they'd break all the same. Pentuts 307 AC. Ser Jorah Mormont. He'd never wished to see this city again, and it stirred up some bad memories in him to be here. Though compared to those that Aenyr's manse stirred up, they could be named as good ones. Just seeing the large gates in front of them as they made their way to the entrance was enough to make Jorah remember betraying his queen. His eyes looking to and thankfully not finding her own looking his way. Over the years he'd told himself that he knew her not at the time, that she was simply a means to an end. Yet, given the depths of the feelings he had for Daenerys, his actions shamed him still. So, as they entered the manse, as Daenerys, Aegon, and Rhaenys dismounted from their horses, Jorah promised himself he'd judge Illyrio as harshly as he would now have judged the man that he himself once was. Cersei, Grey Worm, Ned Dane, Tormund, and their guards all looked around at the opulence that Illyrio surrounded himself with, and other than Cersei May, they did so with impressed looks on their faces. The Lannister knight had known much about opulence, however, he'd lived a life of luxury and knew all about how those with true wealth lived. It was the dangers or prospect of them that Jorah believed Cersei May was now evaluating, not the coin that had been spent on furnishings and trinkets. By your leave, your grace, Jorah said, looking to Daenerys. Aegon nodded and bid him and his guards to do their due diligence. Above their heads, Raquel and Drogon flew and carried their own threat. While down in the manse, Jorah, Grey Worm, and a dozen Unsullied moved about the grounds and the buildings themselves. Nowhere was denied to them, no room was left unchecked, and only once they were certain there were truly no threats to face did they allow the Magister entry to his own home. That had been the offer that the Queen had made to the man. The one demand made when Daenerys had decided that she wished this meeting to be held here and not in Drogo's manse. Now, as Illyrio raced inside as fast as his girth would allow him, Jorah once again found himself lost in memories of days gone past, of letters sent and secrets revealed, a plan that had been formed to kill the woman who'd become the most important person in his life. Turning his head from where Daenerys was speaking softly to Aegon, Jorah reached up and wiped his eyes as subtly as he could. Surprised to find that no tears had actually fallen and that it was just the threat of them that he was feeling. My Empress, my Emperor, Princess, allow me to, Illyrio said breathlessly once he'd reached where they stood. I well remember the way, Magister. Lord Commander, if you will, Daenerys said, cutting Illyrio off before he could truly speak. With a nod to Sir Aegon, Jorah led the way and once again entered the main building of the manse down corridors that he'd walked but moments earlier. He now led them to the largest and most opulent of Illyrio's greeting rooms. The soft couches, numerous chairs, and large tables allowed for the food and refreshments to be brought in almost as soon as Daenerys, Aegon, and Rhaenys had taken their seats. Not that any of them partook in those refreshments, something which could not be said for the Magister, and Jorah was again made to bear witness to the sight of Illyrio, Mopatis gorging himself on dish after dish. How the man had such an appetite, Jorah knew not. His fate was to be decided here today. And even Jorah was unaware what that fate was to be. For the man himself, surely he understood this much, at least. However, if he did, it limited his appetite not. Mayhap a last meal, as it had been when dealing with most of those they'd encountered on their conquest of Essex. Aegon left it to Daenerys to speak. Jorah had heard him tell his wife that not only did she know more about the lands and its people than he did, but she was a much better politician than he was as well. His own strengths lay more in forcing men to their knees than in having them kneel due to the words spoken. However, Jorah did chuckle when Aegon added that his wife and sister were just as adept at that as he was. "Long have I pondered your fate, Magister," Daenerys began, and Illyrio moved to reply. A shake of Aegon's head and a glare at him from Reimagined was more than enough to stop him from doing so. "A part of me wishes for naught more than to see you dead, to make you pay for how you used my brother and I, while another thanks you for it." Looking at Illyrio, Jorah could see just how worried he now was. The fat man was sweating profusely, and yet still he ate food mayhap offering him the comfort that thus far the queen's words had not. "You sold me like a broodmare, Magister." Daenerys' words and tone left none of them in any doubt that it was a statement, not a question she was putting to Illyrio. "Only that my brother was such a willing participant in that sale, or I'd have seen you burn long before now. My Empress." Again it was a shake of Aegon's head and a glaring look from Rhaenys that stilled the Magister's tongue. Daenerys then continued to speak as she made it clear to Illyrio that she knew all of his plans and schemes. The Magister listened as words he'd spoken to Varys, as well as those he'd spoken that he believed went unheard, were now repeated to him. Lady Melora, Lady Kinvara, and the Master of Whisperers had all been only too happy to share what they knew of Illyrio's deeds and actions. "Yet you protected my brother and I too, offered us a safe place to rest and to hide away from the usurper's assassins. The good you did may not outweigh the bad, but it has been taken into account," Daenerys said, turning to look at Aegon, who gave her a supportive nod. A movement behind Grey Worm caught Jorah's eye, and he looked to see one of the servants listening to what was being said and doing so far too keenly. Looking to Seraphime, he motioned to the girl, and without missing a beat, the Lannister knight and Ned Dane were soon escorting her from the room and to another. Only Aegon and Grey Worm paid them any mind while they did so. The king looked angered and annoyed, and yet, for now, he moved not. "You will hand over 1/4 of your wealth immediately, Magister. Pay 1/10 of your income in taxes to the crown each year for the next 10. "It shall be done, my Empress. A part of me wished you to die here today, Magister. Be thankful that it's not that part of me that I listen to. I am, my Empress. Your mercy shall not go unrewarded." To his surprise, Aegon spoke and told the Magister that he was to play a part in the new ruling council of the city, that there was to be no more princes of Pentos, and that any dissension or failure to comply with their directives wouldn't be tolerated. Jorah looked to the queen to see that she was completely aware of this turn of events, and that Aegon hadn't just decided this on a whim. They were working together, fully in conjunction with each other, a true king and queen who he was more than happy to serve for as long as the old gods allowed him to. There were no more words spoken. Daenerys rose to her feet once Aegon had finished speaking, and together with Rhaenys, all three then moved to the door. Illyrio left there looking relieved, as well he should be. As they walked down the corridor, Tormund whispered something in Aegon's ear, and Jorah saw him again nod his head. A moment later, the king shared a kiss with his wife and looked his way. Aegon bid him with his eyes to escort Daenerys and Rhaenys back to their own manse. Out of the corner of his eye, Jorah saw Seraphime motion to the king, and Ned Dane then being sent to join the queen and princess's escort. Then, within no more than a few more moments, they were mounting their horses and riding back through the streets of Pentos. It was not until much later that night that he found out why the servant had been spying on their meeting. Aegon had spoken to the woman personally, and then she'd been brought back to the manse with him when he returned. She'd wished to see Illyrio punished far more severely than he had been, had hoped that the queen or king would be the ones to do so. The young girl had been forced to share the Magister's bed more than once, and her long hope for justice had once again been denied to her. Though her fate was to be changed forever that day, and not only the girl, but Jorah himself welcomed it. "I could see him dead. Make him suffer. His crimes certainly deserve such." Daenerys said softly to the girl, "Yet you will not." The girl sniffled. "My wife and I seek to make all lives better, to end the practices that men like Illyrio practice daily. Yet, as much as we wish to break the wheel, it is not in our power to do fully, not the now." But they set sail 2 days later. Pentos left with a council to rule over it in their empress and emperor's names, and the young girl, Cara, was now part of Daenerys' household. They did so with far more wealth than they'd expected to take with them. The entirety of Illyrio Mopatis's treasury was now on its way to King's Landing, barring that which had been paid to those who had once served the man. As for the Magister, his death was one that Jorah wasn't privy to the details of. He knew only that he'd been found gutted in his bed and had bled out for most of the night. Only that and the words that Daenerys had spoken to Cara alluded to just who had been responsible for that death. You were right. Some wheels need to be broken regardless. Your words were listened to. Cara, Aegon and I always promised to do so. His queen said, her husband's expression showing that it was the king himself who'd taken the Magister from this world. Near to 37 AC, Magister Trombo, his fellow Magisters were fools of the highest order. Nothing that he'd said had been listened to, and instead, they'd sought sellswords from far and wide, none of whom had been truly told just who it was they'd be fighting against. Not that it would even be a true fight, or so Trombo feared. Sitting in his manse, looking over the letters that told the tale of the dragon's conquest, Trombo sighed and wished he was surrounded by cleverer men than those he had the misfortune to name as friends. He sought a solution to the upcoming apocalypse, a way to end the fight before it began, and yet once again that solution eluded him. Drinking down his wine in one go, turning to look out the open window, Trombo could only see Myr in flames. Imaginary though they were for now. Close to 5,000 men they'd gathered at significant cost, and yet even 4 or 5 times that number wouldn't be enough to halt the dragons, but momentarily. They'd called the pirate ships back from the Stepstones and their other dens of iniquity for all the good that would do them. Not only did the dragons have a fleet that dwarfed their own, but the Sea Lord had thrown his lot in with them already. Even were that not so, ships burn and dragons were what truly brought the flames. 3 of them, from what the letters Trombo read, suggested. Fools, the lot of us, he said loudly as he rose to his feet. For once he found himself glad that his wife had died along with his child in the birthing bed. Trombo finally finding a reason to be happy about the worst day of his life. Had Melantha lived, had she and their daughter been here today, then the fear he already felt would have robbed him of his senses completely. For now, it only threatened to rob him of his life and the lives of those who named Myr their home. Moving to the window, Trombo closed his eyes briefly before he opened them to look out on the city below. Happy to no longer see the buildings on fire or the smoke plumes that filled his nights and had intruded on his days as well. He looked down on those who went about their day, unaware of the truth of the threat that moved ever closer, wondered if they believed the nonsense spouted by those who ran this city. While in the distance he could barely see the pointless preparations that were being made to hold the dragons at bay. As if crossbows and stilettos, sellswords and slaves are a match for an emperor-empress and their army. Trombo had been the lone voice that had pleaded with his fellow magisters to treat with the dragons. He'd shown them the letters he'd received which had told of benevolent rulers. True Empress Daenerys was still the selfsame girl she'd once been, and so slaves would need to be freed. Yet, it was a small price to pay in order to keep your life and your position, or so he'd tried to explain. He'd spoken of how, in the cities that had knelt and done so peacefully, those in charge remained in charge. How it was only some and not all of the wealth in their vaults that the dragons had sought to take for their own. In some ways, they'd been no different than the Dothraki in that regard, Trombo had suggested. Yet his words had fallen on deaf ears, and instead of peace, it was to be war. A war we cannot and will not win. Envoys had been sent to Lys and Tyrosh. A grand alliance proposed to take on the might of the Dragon Queen and her husband. The Trireki come again, or so his fellow magisters had believed. The Lysianensis, though, had answered them not. Lysia's first magister and its Gonfalonier were both notable in their silence, while the Archon was a much cleverer man than Trombo's friends had ever credited him to be. The other daughters would sit it out. They'd wait and see, and leave it to Myr to be the fools that pulled on the dragon's tail. Trombo left in no doubt what they'd do once the dust had settled. He knew full well they'd bend and kneel, accept and welcome the dragons as their lords and masters. Just as he knew that in standing up to and forcing the dragons to fight, Myr would be made an example of. Walking from his room, Trombo moved through the manse and looked at all he had gathered over his 65 years. Tapestries that depicted great moments in the history of Essos and of Myr, images of a family that were long since dead, glassware that was the envy of some of the wealthiest men in the city. There, in pride of place, hung a portrait of the woman who'd taken his heart with him when the gods had called her to their side. "I miss you as much today as I did on the day you were taken from me, my love," Trombo said as he looked at the almost lifelike image of his long-departed wife. I shall see you soon. He left the hall behind, the manse soon to follow. If she and their child still lived, then he'd probably have left this city behind by now too. It would have been easy for him to do so, to gather his wealth and take a ship to some far-off land, to live and see another day with his wife and daughter. Mayhap if they lived still, he'd have found the strength to stand up even more against his fellow magisters, found the words to make them see the folly they were engaging in. Alas, the gods had decided to take them both from his side nigh on 30 years ago, and he'd long since lost any strength he'd once possessed. Passing by the makeshift defenses, Trombo sighed. Wooden barricades and stone towers would stop a dragon's flames. Not crossbow bolts wouldn't pierce a dragon's scales, and Trombo doubted that any would get the chance to try their luck against the armor that their riders wore. He looked to the docks and almost laughed at the blockade that his foolish fellow magisters believed would keep the dragons at bay. Images of ships aflame right there behind his closed eyelids, should he deign to close his eyes. Soon he was standing outside the one place in Myr where the might of the dragons was truly understood. The Red Priestess simply beckoned him inside as if she'd been awaiting him there. Come, there is much we must talk on, Magister, the woman said. Her red hair stirred up images of flames and fire in his mind. I fear the time for talking has long since passed, Lady Erlia. Trombo sighed. To stop the war it certainly has. Yet what is lost in the fire can be found again, Uriah replied. Later that night, Trombo looked out the window once more. Again he saw flames covering the city, though this time he saw them far more clearly than he'd ever seen them before. He saw ships burn, sellswords and soldiers aflame. Magisters ran as dragons chased them down. Yet the people remained unburnt. Their homes were never touched by the fires that swept over the city. Night fell and the fires soon burned out. The smoke from those fires finally cleared and he saw himself on his knees and swearing oaths he knew he'd live up to.